So my name is Pat Riley. I'm the Chief of Farrier Services at the University of Pennsylvania. Thank you for coming out for this. This is a bit of a unique opportunity from my perspective. I certainly didn't expect when I started working here to be involved with a collection of antique shoes and specimens, but I'd like to try and tell a story about my experience with this collection, and hopefully this will have some interest in the rest of the university system, and in particular through the library and with regard to the other collections that we have within the hospital. This is a view, a picture, and this is what I open almost all of my presentations with. This is a view of the University of Pennsylvania Veterinary School's farrier shop when it first opened in 1884, and I'll reference back to that a couple of times. This is a slide, and again, I'll reference back, use this slide several times, but this is a little bit of a history of horseshoes, just to kind of lay the groundwork a little bit. Horses were first domesticated in 4000 BC, so about 6,000 years ago. The first blacksmiths were recorded evidence of that was in 3500 BC. And the first nail-on horseshoes that we have evidence of, there are a couple of conflicting reports, but somewhere right around 80 BC that were found in a collection of Roman artifacts in Great Britain. Farriery started in England. It received a royal charter for the Worshipful Company of Farriers in 1674. And a couple of things to kind of notice in here. Here's the beginning of the University of Pennsylvania Vet School in 1884. And the Royal Veterinary Charter for Veterinarians didn't start until around 1850, just before that. So for a large period of time in here, from the start where farriers were, back in 80 BC when we first started applying shoes, we've been around for a long time as farriers, but the veterinary community has really just kind of come around in the last 150 years or so. I'm going to try and paint a little bit of a story in here looking at some of the roles of farriery and some of the roles of veterinary medicine and how they interact right in here. I first started working here at the University of Pennsylvania about 6 or 7 years ago, and this is the one job that I've been shoeing horses for 20 years, and I promised my wife I would never ask her to move until the University of Pennsylvania called. This is the job that I got into this industry with or this profession with a goal of doing. This is the spot where we have the most progressive farriers anywhere. Jack Anderson is a legend in the farrier world, and I don't know if you noticed, but he has a monument that's outside. It's one of the few monuments you'll see. His anvil is in the center of the courtyard outside of the surgery building. And this man in particular, Rob Sigafus, who was a good friend of mine and my immediate predecessor here, really turned around and revolutionized the farriery, the state of farrier and how it's conducted. Polymer shoes, whether it's silicone materials for supporting feet, glue-on shoes that were patented to the University of Pennsylvania, specifically through the farrier program. And we do a lot of novel techniques, carbon fiber and Kevlar hoof wall reconstructions, different ways of helping the horse. These are relatively new processes with regard to maintaining feet. The reason I point that out is because the collection of shoes around me and the general practice of horseshoeing, as I commented on in your tour in the farrier shop this morning, it really hasn't changed dramatically in the last 250, 300 years. We generally take a straight piece of metal, we heat it up in a forge of one sort, whether it's propane-fueled or coal, and we bend it to shape, to support and to fit every individual foot, regardless of the size or shape of the animal. So when I first started working at New Bolton Center, I spent 6 months living in the Alum House, where we just had lunch. I don't know if this has changed, but the Alum House has no internet connection. There were no cable TVs. There was essentially very little to do there for 6 months. So I buried my head in some of the antique books that were there. In addition to the antique books and reading through some of the history of the vet school, I also turned around. We have 70 buildings here on about 1,000 acres. And I spent a large part of my time exploring after hours. I would just kind of walk through buildings and look around. And I started to get a little bit, this was Jack Anderson's monument, which is outside of the surgery complex CMK building. This was removed several years ago, and everybody had kind of lost sight of this. This anvil was kind of missing from its stump, literally, for about 6 or 7 years. I was a little bit motivated. I was walking through one of the old buildings down here, and I found the anvil. I actually shaped shoes on it and worked on it for about a week before I drove past the empty anvil stand out there and lined it up and thought, I'm working off of somebody's monument. But I was a bit motivated by what I found right here, by kind of rediscovering and finding where some of these, an artifact like Jack Anderson's monument, like his anvil, and being able to restore that a little bit. So one of the books that I found in the Alum House had a reference to, this goes back to 1884, had a reference to a podological museum. And this was something I came across in a couple of different ways. In one of my trips down through some of the old buildings, I came across some old boxes filled with all kinds of specimens, all kinds of shoes. And actually, these cabinets you see posted up are the same ones that are positioned all around me. So we actually came across a collection of shoes that I was trying to decide what it is, to see if this is, put some pieces together. It's a bit motivated. I came across a couple of other references to it. This is a gentleman named Frank McGinnis, farrier from Ohio. The shoe he's actually holding right there is one that he presented to a collection of shoes at New Bolton Center. Unfortunately, I found a shoe which has the name McGinnis on the bottom of it. So we're starting to put together that the collection of shoes that I came across go back a little bit in time. This is Bob Charles, who was a farrier at New Bolton Center in the late 70s and early 80s. And standing next to him is a well-known farrier in this region, a gentleman by the name of Bruce Daniels, who's explaining the use of some of the shoes in our collection. So with the information I had, I picked up the phone and I called Mr. Daniels and I inquired about what did he know about our collection, what kind of information could he share. And he came down and started the process of establishing or reestablishing some of the information and putting some of the stories and identifying some of the shoes that we have on display right here. We're kind of lucky in some instances. If you notice on this shoe right here, we have the initials F and the last name Eng stamped into the shoe. Farriers were very proud of their work at times, and they were very known to stamp their names in it, which is really helpful from our point of view in terms of establishing not only the artist or the farrier who was putting these together, but the time period from which these came. As I was unpacking some of the boxes, I found evidence of things that you just don't normally see. I've read about this device. This is called a Defay shoe spreader, and this was a mechanical device that was used. You would nail a shoe onto a horse's foot, and this actually worked as a vise, and it was meant to spread apart a foot that was contracted or too narrow. And this is something you just don't see, but we did find a couple of references to it, in particular in one old textbook, and kept finding other examples of the specimens that we would see in our collection right here, not only shoes, but actually preserved feet that go along with some of these textbooks, right? And as we moved through all of this, kept seeing example after example of specimens and shoes which were represented in the literature, specifically from this one book. The book was called The Textbook of Horseshoeing for Horseshoers and Veterinarians. It was later abridged to being On Horseshoeing, was the title of it that was given around the 8th edition of this. And this was written by a German farrier named Anton Lungwitz and translated with the help of a University of Pennsylvania professor, John Adams. And the key in here is there are 229 illustrations in this. Many of the illustrations in this book are represented in the shelves around me right here. So now we have a title for it, using the antique, or the writings, the collection of writings, which refer to it as the Podological Museum, and specifically as University of Pennsylvania's Podological Museum, with Franz Eng, who was the farrier here, and in 1893 described as the curator. Not only do we have a title for the person overseeing the collection, but we also have a title for the collection itself. And with the approval of Dean Hendricks, I've asked Bruce Daniels to serve as the curator of this, and he's put a tremendous amount of time into trying to catalog and relay some of the information, digging into the history of some of the shoes, and we'll talk a little bit about this. What I'd like to do a little bit for the collection, for the presentation today, I don't think you're going to have a tremendous amount of interest in some of the subtle nuances between one shoe and another. But what I'd like to do is maybe try to tell a little bit of a story about how horseshoes fit into the time frame of this period. Specifically looking at the Civil War time period. Next, looking at how farriers and how the farrier education process evolved through the University of Pennsylvania. And finally, looking at the time period, maybe up through 1950, and looking at some of the industrial developments and how horseshoes played a role in this. So starting, going back to the Civil War time frame, remember we had no veterinarians at this point, right? Up through veterinarian medicine really didn't start until 1844 in England, but there were no veterinary schools in the United States. There were very few, if any, people who had attended veterinary school in this country, and the common practice was for farriers to serve as the veterinarians, providing for the medical needs of these horses. So the farrier is a very skilled person and was represented as such through the Union Army. Every cavalry had its own farrier. They took care of not only the shoeing of horses, not only the fabrication of shoes, as was commonly provided by not only farriers but blacksmiths, which are a little bit of a separate profession. It's probably worth pointing out. I think today we use the term blacksmith and farrier as a synonymous term. In this time frame, in the Civil War period, remember we had no veterinarians. So farriers were the people who were attending to the medical needs of horses and applying the shoes. Blacksmiths were people who were either fabricating the horseshoes along with other farm tools, other metal tools of the age. But blacksmiths were generally not responsible for putting shoes on horses. That was specifically in the domain of farriers. So there's a little bit of a different terminology from how we think of this today. Interestingly, in the Civil War time frame, every farrier was assigned 2 horseshoes to carry in their backpack along with 12 nails, moving substitute and replacement horseshoes through so that they had supplies necessary as they were traveling through the front. They did have portable forges. This is a representation of, you can see the anvil here on the right, and a little bit of there's a ceramic or a kiln forge in the center of it with all the supplies. There are bellows in the front of this. Everything necessary to both make and modify horseshoes that were transported right up to the front in the Civil War. There's a little bit of a difference in here, and if you look back at the general timeline, if I go back one more, this is a pretty important reference point right here. The first successful machine-made shoe, the first patent was actually in 1835, but the first successful machine-made shoe really didn't happen until 1859. So at the beginning of the Civil War, about 11% of the horseshoes that used by the Union Army were machine-made. Everything else had to be manufactured from a straight piece of metal. The advent of machine-produced shoes, and this was the most commonly worn shoe at the beginning of the Civil War. It's called the Burden horseshoe. These were manufactured in Troy, New York. And later, through the end of the Civil War, the advent of, or the development of this shoe, in addition to some of the other companies, this is a shoe called the Good Enough shoe, and we'll talk about that one quite a bit later, by the end of the war, represented about 90% of all horseshoe production was machine-made shoes as opposed to being fabricated one at a time by a blacksmith. And this gave the North a tremendous advantage. The number of horses that were used in the Civil War, this is a famous photograph called The Men Who Shot a Million Horses. And this was in Geesboro, right outside of Washington, D.C. What the Union Army would do is hang around in New York waiting for boats where we had immigrants coming from England and Ireland. There were a lot of very well-trained farriers that were suddenly became available to the Union forces. They were contracted. A lot of these people were moved down to the Geesboro area. And now we have this combination of personnel available in the form of immigrants who are well-skilled in farriery to apply the shoes and to shoe the horses. And we had industry producing, for the first time, quality horseshoes capable of cutting the time constraints in terms of fabricating these shoes. According to one doctoral thesis, there's it required a team of 2 or 3 farriers could shoe 40 horses in 1 month if they had to make everything themselves, making the horseshoes, making the nails. When you had machine-produced shoes and nails available, one farrier was then able to maintain 150 horses per month. So this led to a very productive farrier task force. and gave the North a considerable advantage. This is the Braden Horseshoe Company, which later produced the Good Enough shoes that were in Cascadewa, Pennsylvania. Entire industries grew out of the production of horseshoes, and whole towns were kind of formed over some of these production facilities. The South, the Confederacy by comparison, had very few trained farriers. As a general rule, the South did not take slaves as enlisted men. There were exceptions, and this is one that came from the U.S. Library of Congress. Negro Ellick, who was reported to be, was listed as being a farrier, was not only inducted into the Confederate Army, but he had a salary that was associated with them at 2 months and 40 cents per day. So this was a evidence, in some ways, of the South's lacking of manpower to produce these shoes. And they had no iron industry, per se. They had no production facilities, so they were still fashioning all their shoes one at a time in a handmade version. And the impact of this was pretty impressive. I hate to read off of slides, but there's some great references in here through a brigadier general for the Confederacy talking about the problems they encountered in retreating from Gettysburg with footsore horses due to a lack of horseshoes and a lack of opportunity of people to put these on. My favorite part at the end was as they were commandeering horses from the Pennsylvania countryside, trying to get their artillery and their men out of the front, was that, you know, the main problem was if the northern people, that we wouldn't have this problem if the northern army or government would just stop fighting us. I thought that was a great reference in there. Clearly, that's the issue. So now we have, as we go through the Civil War, the whole dynamics have changed. If we look at the population of horses, in 1867, and by the end of the war, the population of horses in this country had grown to 8 million, which was substantially higher than it was at the beginning of the war. So now we have this burgeoning population of horses. We have people who are skilled in applying some of the shoes who have come over from other countries. And we have the capability of producing shoes on a mass-produced level, on a much greater level. The next question is who's going to take care of these horses? And this is where the University of Pennsylvania had a role to play in this. After the war, in 1879, that was the first year that the U.S. Army required that a veterinary surgeon actually have graduated from college. At that point in time, there were supposedly 300 people in the United States who had graduated from vet school, almost all of those having emigrated from Europe. So there's very, very few people available to take care, that's 300 people essentially, to take care of 8 million horses. So there's a big need that kind of came in through this. And with that, the University of Pennsylvania started, and specifically, there were some really great examples of how they incorporated farriers into the veterinary school. The first part, it was one of the first buildings that was constructed. I love the explanation of this. To provide an additional means of income, which is probably still true today. That's one of the reasons that there's a farrier program at the University of Pennsylvania, is to help provide additional income through the farrier service. But the original plan, and I think this is important because we're looking at how the veterinary profession developed and how they incorporated or developed around farriers. But the original plan was for there to be a practical aspect of the education. So as a veterinary student, if I look at some of the slides that we've used, these are not farriers learning to shoe horses. These are veterinarians being taught how to shoe horses by farriers, right? How to shoe horses by farriers. They were overseen by a veterinarian who was overseeing the farrier, Mr. Garrett Edwards' services. And that practice went on for about 10 years. I think it's interesting, in the Harper's Weekly, there are several references to a practical pharmacy, a practical farrier. It seems that was an important aspect of the vet school education, was in terms of lending to the demands of the public and making this a practical finding. So that went on for about 10 years. And this is one of my favorite lines ever. Professor of Surgery and Obstetrics John Adams recognized the futility of trying to make practical farriers out of veterinarians. There are a lot of skills that farriers possess that are very hard to teach in a couple of weeks. My students could probably attest to that. I don't know. So they made a new plan. What they did what Adams did was to travel to Europe, and he spent a period of time working with a well-known farrier professor, head of a school of farriery named Anton Lungwitz. And in his time in Europe, he turned around and he recognized, took one of Anton Lungwitz's pupils, a gentleman by the name of Franz Eng, whose name is stamped on a lot of these shoes, and hired him to be the head farrier at the University of Pennsylvania. They assigned him the role of lecturer and instructor, and he was considered to be a man of considerable skill. And as opposed to our early steps, where the farrier was being overseen by the veterinarian, what we ended up with was Franz Eng basically becoming a full professor of podology and providing almost a unique service within the educational system. But now the focus of the education that's provided is all on the theory of horseshoeing as opposed to on the practice, trying to understand, have a better idea of the mechanics of what's going on. When Franz Eng moved to the United States from Germany, he brought with him most of the shoes that are in this collection. So if I pick up some of the shoes, there are a couple of different collections, a couple of different displays here. Some of these, in fact everything in this cabinet over here to my right, is stamped with Dresden, Germany, Lederschmied, which apparently means farrier school, and each one has a Roman numeral on it going from 1 to 40. This was part of a very well-developed educational process where they would start with a very simple shoe. Once they mastered the construction of this, they would move on to more and more difficult shoes. So they had a very well-described process and a very well-established way of teaching and ensuring that there were well-skilled people. In the United States, we didn't have any of that. We had farriers who were essentially the jack of all trades, practicing as veterinarians, practicing as horsemen, fashioning tools and other blacksmithing duties on the side, in addition to shoeing horses. And now we're finding a little bit of an age of specialization. One of Anton Lungwitz's work, and this is interesting because most papers that you would still see referenced today, or written today on the subject of how a horse's foot behaves when they stand on it, how does that horse's foot deform, most of it was based on, or you'll still see references to Anton Lungwitz's early projects on hoof capsule distortion. And we are very fortunate to have one of the authentic pieces here. This is probably the most unique piece in our collection. What was done with this was there was a shoe that was applied. It had a metallic paint that was painted on the outside of it. There was a very primitive battery which was set up to create an electric current. We'd take the horse and we would trot it off, and if the horse's foot deformed enough so it would touch one of these screws, then this bell would go off. So this was, and for something, it's an ingenious idea, and both, incredible in its simplicity and its sophistication, I guess, considering that they were doing this in the day. I've had there's a world specialist, a guy from the University of Guelph named Jeff Thomason, who came by, who was actually amazed that we've seen this, because this is the only account he's ever seen. This is referred to as the Foreigner apparatus. And this is, to our knowledge, the only one that actually has survived through existence. Not only the shoe itself, but with the specimen attached to it. The battery is missing. But other than that, it is the most complete version of what's out there. So now getting through, now we've established a different way of educating the people who are caring for horses in our community. By the time you get to 1900, and this is where the first translation of, to backtrack a little bit, John Adams, professor of surgery at University of Pennsylvania, travels to Europe, and he works with Anton Lungwitz, and he comes back with a book called On Horseshoeing, or a textbook of horseshoeing for farriers and veterinarians. There are a couple of different titles for the same version. The translated version was published in this country in 1904, and it serves as the basis for a lot of farrier education even to this day. The original notes of this manuscript are all in the Fairman Rogers collection. All of the original illustrations based of, as schematics done of this shoe right here, these are all part of the Fairman Rogers collection. What we've done is continue to add to this collection since then. And in the time frame in the early 1900s, horseshoes have now become, and the horse industry has now become, a major economic consideration. The number of horses in 1915 skyrocketed to 21.5 million. There's some references of horses in 1910 with 27.5 million horses in that time frame. That's a huge jump, but at least now we have some people that are responsible, that are being educated in this country for the care of these animals. There was a huge influx of economic importance out of this. As Ann Green has pointed out to me in a conversation the other day, we've gone from having clients that own 1 or 2 or 10 horses to the United States Army with millions of horses, to railways which employ thousands of horses. And with this comes a whole other set of economic importance. It took me a long time. As I said, farriers stamped their names on some of these shoes, and I couldn't figure out, I figured this had to be somebody's initials, the NOA, because I kept finding this on variable shoes. Turns out this is the National Horseshoers Association stamp. It's not an O in the middle, it's a bar shoe. And a bar shoe, some of the horses, I pointed this out up in our shop earlier, but some of the shoes that we use are circular in shape, and that's what's being reflected in here. So this is actually a bar shoe in the center of it. Farriers were highly unionized in the early 1900s. Were some of the most powerful unions in this country. The general rule was if I was in a union and I was working in a shop in Pennsylvania, and a horse came in and they asked me to reset the shoes, I wouldn't do it if it didn't come in with a union label on it. So the stamps were there to help continue and help to protect some of the unionized work that was being done. There was also some evidence of corruption that I thought was pretty cool. One of the shoes that we have several examples of is referred to as the Good Enough shoe. And this was originally produced in New York City and later was produced in Pennsylvania along with in a couple of other locations. These shoes were very distinctive in their shape in that they had calks at each heel, prominences at each heel for traction, and also one at the center of the toe. And there's a whole manifesto. It's called Rational Horseshoeing. That's in a book in the Fairman Rogers collection. It's a 50-page book basically justifying the use of this shoe and how revolutionary it's going to be and how it's going to solve horses by changing how their feet absorb energy. But these were the sorts. There were actually unions who would refuse to use them. There would be contracts. The U.S. government later decided to use half of one shoe company and half of another shoe, half the burden shoe and half on the Good Enough shoe. So there were a lot of finances that were associated with this and a lot of economic impact. General Custer was supposedly involved with trying to get trips to Europe for he and his officers for approving the use of the Good Enough shoe for use in his terms. Good Enough, by the way, being a reference to the owner of the company, the proprietor of the company, not a quality assessment of it being good enough. But there were great articles and comments about the Good Enough shoe not being quite good enough for Custer's army, at least at his Custer's last stand. And this is, just had somebody who was commenting that they were out at the Calgary Stampede this past week. This is a contest that is held annually in Calgary, and farriers from all around the world, blacksmiths from all around the world, because these are people who are fabricating shoes, arrive with a goal of producing certain shoes, and you have quite literally dozens of forges set up inside and dozens of people building shoes to see who can replicate some of the most difficult shoes to fabricate. Particular interest in this year was that 2 of the shoes that were used, this one being a salmon sideweight shoe, is reflected within our collection. So we have examples from this that are still in use today. This shoe is referred to as the German or the Swiss Army shoe. I say that German or Swiss because depending on who you talk to, I actually think the contest is wrong. In our collection, this is described as the Swiss Army shoe. These were produced for the Swiss Army off-site. So essentially they would have a production facility in a large city. They would have all of their forges, all of their blacksmiths together, and what they would do is fabricate shoes that were able to be, these are handmade, but they're made in generic sizes. They're made in generic shapes so they can be applied to a large amount of feet. And they have 8 nail holes on each side of the foot, so the horseshoer, the farrier, would have plenty of options about how to apply this shoe to any given foot. So this was kind of a the utilitarian shoe, and then just the shoe itself, the shoes and nails would then need to be shipped to the front, as opposed to having individual forges separate, as was evidenced in the Civil War with the U.S. side. Also, to talk a little about why is this specific, laminitis is a disease that is still the #2 leading cause of death in horses. If we look at history, one of the things we used to find in a lot of the textbooks was standing horses within a cold brook, some sort of method of cooling their feet down. Now that was thought to be a bit silly when you hit the mid-1900s. No one did it anymore. What's interesting is that with today's science, we're now looking back and finding justifications for why that was done, and that there was some scientific evidence to support that type of decision making. Now we have thermography, we can look at the effect of different cooling methods, and we have commercially produced cooling items, and to this day, that's still the only way we have to prevent laminitis, and this is something that's been written about historically at length. In our mechanical studies, I mentioned in your tour earlier this morning that we were doing some work with an in-shoe force measuring system. It's kind of interesting from our perspective now. This is what we're able to see in terms of the layer we're putting in membrane in between the hoof and the shoe. And now we're able to capture some of the forces that are occurring between those two. Now we can change different shoes and critically examine different shoeing styles and the effect of different shoes as we're looking and considering different ideas about how to shoe a horse. When it comes to a problem like laminitis, one of the things that we've decided is important is that the force at this area at the foot is one that we'd like to lessen as much as possible. We're trying to take force specifically off of certain areas of the foot to help serve a protective role. And one of the things that we've observed, this is kind of an interesting, this is Lungwit's version of a shoe for laminitis. And picking up a textbook, you have a certain amount of appreciation for what we're looking at. There's a view of this hoof specimen that I'm holding in my hand right here. It's the exact replication of it. The interesting part is that being able to consider this in a three-dimensional sense, being able to pick it up and look at some of the nuances that's here, we can see certain things that just aren't apparent in the text. We can see that they actually shod the horse and positioned the shoe so that there was no weight at all in the front half of the foot, which is exactly the conclusion that we're coming up to with some of our technologies that we're utilizing today. I thought I'd put this one up in conclusion on this. This is not a made-up thing. This actually is National Farrier Week, and that's wrapping up tomorrow. I don't think I've seen any love from my colleagues at the Voting Center this week. Yeah, I haven't let them know about this. I hope this helps to, put it in a little bit of a context. We have a unique collection here. We have a unique set of material, and one that I think is very important. We've had communications from the University in Germany. The vet school in Germany has contacted us about this specimen. We've had several people from Europe come over and tour the exhibit over here. This is something of some international importance. We are still trying to put together some of the pieces of this, and a large part of our issue, not only is our collection have some gaps in terms of the understanding, but a lot of how farriery was communicated was directly from, by word of mouth. So it was master to apprentice in terms of how this information was communicated. One of the problems that we've encountered is that you notice in here in the number of horses, we had approximately, let's see if we go back in here, at the turn of the century we had somewhere around 27 million horses. The advent of the automobile came in, and all of a sudden that number fell to 2 million in the 1950s, and potentially even lower than that in the late 1950s. So a lot of the information that we had, a lot of our understanding of horseshoeing just went by the wayside. That chain was essentially broken because we had so few people passing that information around. Now it's almost a period of rediscovery, trying to come out and look at the shoes and try and figure out what people were using these for and how they were using this to care for horses. I was a bit worried about this being too dry in terms of, looking at some of the nuances. Is an entirely different lecture than I would give to a group of farriers who are, here to comment or here to look at some of the shoes. But I hope there was some interest in this. I hope this has some. I hope putting this in a society context was useful for you. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.